Prince George saw a royal guard being provoked and stepped in without hesitation. The morning sun bathed the palace gardens in a gentle golden light. The flowers were in full bloom, their colors bright and cheerful, filling the air with a soft fragrance. Birds flitted from tree to tree, their melodies mixing with the quiet murmur of the crowd gathering near the palace gates. It was a special day, one of those rare days when the royal family would be visible to the public, greeting visitors, waving from balconies, and walking through the gardens to enjoy a peaceful moment. Among the people who had come to see the royals, excitement bubbled like a quiet river beneath the surface. Families with young children, tourists from distant lands, and curious locals had all come together in anticipation. The atmosphere was a mixture of reverence and joy, with occasional laughter from children chasing bubbles in the wind or waving small flags with the royal crest. Among the crowd, Prince George walked quietly, holding his mother's hand as they made their way through the garden paths. His small figure was dressed neatly, as always in the sort of clothes that suited a young royal. Smart, comfortable, and appropriate for both a stroll and meeting the public. But even though he looked like any other young boy in appearance, there was something in his eyes that made it clear he was already beginning to understand the responsibilities that came with his title. George's eyes were wide and alert, noticing everything around him. The way the sunlight danced on the leaves, how the security guards moved with quiet precision, and the faces of the people, full of hope, curiosity, and admiration. George loved exploring the gardens. Each tree, flower bed, and pathway held its own little mysteries. He had a favorite fountain where the water sprayed in a perfect arc, catching the sunlight like 1,000 tiny diamonds. Today, however, he was more focused on the people around him than on the familiar features of the garden. He noticed a small boy pointing excitedly at the guards, and George smiled quietly to himself. He could see the guards' calm expression as they stood still, holding their post without a single twitch of impatience, even as the crowd whispered and moved around them. George had always been fascinated by the guards. There was something heroic in the way they stood so straight, their eyes alert, and their posture unwavering. They reminded him of knights in the stories he loved, brave and strong, standing ready to protect those who could not protect themselves. As he walked alongside his mother, George's small hand felt the reassuring presence of her grip, but his mind was already observing the details of the day. The royal family had taught him to be polite, courteous, and kind, but also to pay attention and understand what was happening around him. Even at his young age, George had begun to notice the subtle ways people behaved, the smiles that were sincere, the gestures of respect, and even the tiny signs of impatience or tension. Today, as he looked at the crowd, he noticed something different. There was a slight unease in the air, almost invisible to most, but clear to his keen eyes. One of the guards, normally composed and unshakable, seemed to be slightly tense, his eyes flicking from one person to another. George paused, curious, and tilted his head to get a better view. He saw a man near the edge of the crowd who seemed to be trying to get the guard's attention in a way that was not polite. The man's gestures were loud, his voice raised just enough to be noticed, and there was a teasing, almost disrespectful tone in the way he spoke. George's small brows furrowed. He did not like seeing anyone treated unfairly, and even though he was young, he already had a sense of right and wrong. He could feel that the guard, who had always been strong and calm, was now facing a test of patience. George's mind worked quickly. He thought about the stories his parents had told him, stories of leaders who acted with fairness, courage, and kindness, even when the situation was difficult. He realized in that moment that sometimes courage was not about doing something grand or being the center of attention. Sometimes it was about noticing when someone needed help and quietly stepping in. George continued to walk slowly, keeping his eyes on the situation. He noticed the subtle movements of the crowd, how some people were leaning closer to get a better view, how others whispered to each other, and how the man continued to provoke the guard, trying to get a reaction. The guard's hands were steady at his sides, but George could see the slight tension in his shoulders. It was a small detail, something most people would miss, but George saw it. He felt a sense of empathy for the guard, understanding that even people who appeared strong and unshakable could feel pressure. At that moment, George made a quiet decision in his mind. He would watch closely and be ready to act if needed. As they walked further along the garden path, George's mother, noticing her son's attention to detail, smiled softly. She had always admired how curious and thoughtful George was, how he paid attention to the small things that often went unnoticed. George felt her gaze, a comforting reminder that he was safe and supported, but his eyes remained fixed on the guard and the man provoking him. The crowd continued to murmur and move around them, the excitement of seeing the royal family creating a lively, almost magical atmosphere. Children waved small flags, couples took photographs, and the sound of laughter mixed with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Yet amidst all this, George remained focused. He noticed something else, the way the man provoking the guard seemed unaware of the importance of respect. He was loud, brash, and seemed to think that his actions were amusing. George felt a small spark of determination. He had been taught that true strength and leadership were not about making noise or showing off. They were about understanding, fairness, and standing up for what was right. George thought about the stories of knights and leaders who acted bravely, not for glory, but because it was the right thing to do. He realized that even as a young prince, he could act in a way that showed kindness, courage, and respect. As they continued, George took a careful step closer to the situation. He was still holding his mother's hand, but he was also observing, thinking, and preparing. He noticed the expressions of the people around him, some curious, some concerned, and some simply enjoying the garden without noticing the small tension nearby. George felt a sense of responsibility, not because anyone had asked him to act, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. He understood, even in his young mind, that courage often began with small actions, quiet decisions, and careful observation. The sunlight continued to shine down, casting soft shadows across the garden paths. George felt the warmth on his face, the gentle breeze in his hair, and the soft sounds of the crowd around him. But in the midst of all this, his attention remained sharp. He watched the guard, the man, and the subtle movements of the people nearby. He felt a growing sense of readiness, a quiet determination that he could not yet fully explain, but that felt natural and strong. He knew that he was witnessing a moment where small actions could make a big difference, and even though he was young, he felt ready to respond if the situation required it. At that moment, George realized something important. Courage was not about being fearless, but about understanding when action was needed, even in the face of uncertainty. Leadership was not about commanding others, but about noticing, caring, and acting with respect. And kindness was not just about words, but about standing up for others when they could not stand up for themselves. George felt a quiet pride in his ability to see the situation clearly, to understand the feelings of those involved, and to prepare himself for whatever might come next. The crowd continued to enjoy the day, unaware of the small tension that had begun to develop near the guard. Children laughed, couples smiled, and the birds sang as if nothing were amiss. But George's eyes remained focused, his mind alert and his heart steady. He understood in a way that few could at his age that even small moments could matter greatly. And as he walked, observing, learning, and preparing, he felt a quiet confidence growing within him. A confidence that would guide him through the events of the day and help him act with courage, kindness, and wisdom. In that peaceful yet lively garden, under the warm morning sun, Prince George's journey of understanding, observation, and quiet bravery had begun. He was ready to notice, ready to act, and ready to show that even a young prince could make a difference in the smallest but most meaningful ways. And though the day was still young, it was clear that something important was about to unfold, something that would reveal the courage, empathy, and wisdom already present in the heart of a young royal named George. As Prince George continued to walk through the sunlit palace gardens, his eyes remained alert. The peaceful morning had begun to show its first hints of tension, though most of the crowd was still happily enjoying the surroundings. George had noticed the guard being subtly provoked, and something in his young mind urged him to pay closer attention. There was a small, unusual energy in the air, a tension that seemed almost invisible to the casual observer but was clear to George. He could see that the guard, though standing tall and steady, had a flicker of unease in his eyes. Even the best trained individuals could feel the pressure when someone intentionally tried to test their patience, and George, with his keen observation, had picked up on that almost immediately. The man who was provoking the guard did so with a kind of casual boldness. He leaned slightly too close, speaking in a tone that carried across the small clearing, enough for some of the nearby visitors to hear. His words were teasing, challenging, and disrespectful, though not loud enough to draw the attention of the entire crowd. George noticed the subtle changes in the guard's expression, the tightening of the jaw, the slight narrowing of the eyes, and the controlled breaths that revealed the effort it took to maintain composure. George had always been fascinated by people who could remain calm under pressure, and now he was seeing it firsthand. Walking a few steps closer, George could observe the interaction more clearly. He noticed that the man seemed to think this was all a game, a source of amusement. He waved his hands, spoke lightly but provocatively, and even leaned slightly toward the guard, as if to see how far he could push before getting a reaction. The crowd around them had not yet noticed the tension. Most were chatting, taking photos, and enjoying the beautiful day. But George's small figure, moving quietly with his mother beside him, reflected a growing awareness. He realized that something important was happening, and that sometimes bravery meant noticing danger or discomfort even before it became visible to everyone else. George's mind worked quickly. He remembered the stories his parents had told him about courage, respect, and kindness. Leaders were not always those who shouted the loudest or commanded attention. Often, they were those who observed, understood, and acted when necessary. George understood in a simple but profound way that the guard was being tested, not physically but mentally and emotionally. And even though George was young, he felt that he could do something to help in his own quiet way. He watched the guard carefully. The man continued to provoke him, stepping slightly closer and speaking more insistently. George could see the guard's eyes flicker to the crowd, almost silently asking for support, though the nature of his duty required him to remain composed. The tension was subtle but growing, like a quiet drumbeat building beneath a calm melody. George felt a mixture of curiosity and concern. He had always been taught to notice when someone needed help, and now he could see it clearly. The guard needed calm, respect, and perhaps a small intervention to stop the situation from escalating. Nearby, the crowd remained unaware, but a few observant visitors noticed the subtle tension. A young girl holding her mother's hand pointed slightly and whispered, "Why is that man bothering the guard?" Her mother gently hushed her, saying that sometimes adults acted in strange ways. George, however, understood. He could feel in his heart that even small acts of provocation could be stressful for anyone, and that someone, even someone very young, could help make a difference. The man provoking the guard seemed to grow bolder. His gestures became slightly more animated, his tone sharper, though still not alarming to the larger crowd. He leaned toward the guard, clearly trying to test his patience. George noticed the guard's hands tighten slightly, though he remained in his formal stance. George understood immediately that the guard was doing everything he could to stay professional and polite, and he felt a surge of respect for him. The guard was calm, disciplined, and steadfast, even under pressure. But George also knew that anyone, no matter how disciplined, could feel vulnerable when faced with persistent provocation. George thought carefully about what to do. He did not want to shout or act in a way that would draw unnecessary attention, but he wanted to help. He remembered the small lessons he had learned from his parents and tutors. Kindness, courage, and empathy were sometimes shown through quiet action. Sometimes just standing near someone, showing attention, or calmly speaking could make a difference. George decided to remain close, observing every small movement, ready to act if needed, and prepared to do so with calm confidence. The man, sensing that he might be noticed, glanced briefly around him. He seemed slightly surprised to see George watching so closely. George met the man's gaze steadily, not with fear or anger, but with a quiet seriousness that seemed to carry more authority than his small stature would suggest. George understood that confidence was not about size or age, but about composure and clarity of intention. His eyes communicated a calm determination, and though the man was older and taller, there was something in George's presence that demanded a pause, if only for a moment. As George continued to watch, he noticed that the guard, now aware of George's calm attention, seemed to relax slightly. The subtle tension in his shoulders eased, and his eyes regained a steadier focus. George realized that his presence, simple as it was, had already made a small difference. By observing and being present, he had reminded the guard that he was not alone, and that even a young observer could offer support through attention and respect. George also began to notice the reactions of other visitors nearby. A few people glanced toward the interaction, curious but unsure of what was happening. George could sense their uncertainty, and he understood that sometimes a small act of courage or intervention could prevent confusion or escalation. Even without speaking, George's calm, attentive presence was sending a message that respect, attention, and fairness mattered. The man provoking the guard, sensing that the dynamic had shifted slightly, paused for a brief moment. He looked at George, then back at the guard, as if reconsidering his approach. George did not flinch. He remained composed, calm, and attentive, making it clear through his demeanor that he was aware of the situation and would not tolerate unnecessary disrespect. His young mind understood a simple truth. Sometimes, authority and courage could be expressed through quiet, firm presence rather than loud words or actions. George's mother, observing her son, felt a mixture of pride and admiration. She had taught him to be kind, respectful, and observant, but she also understood that courage often appeared in small, unexpected ways. Seeing George stand quietly but attentively, she realized that he was learning to navigate complex social situations even at his young age. She smiled gently, allowing him the space to observe and understand the moment without interfering. Meanwhile, the man provoking the guard seemed slightly uneasy now. George's calm, focused presence had altered the energy of the situation. What had begun as a small, teasing challenge now felt different. The man realized that this was no longer just a game or a casual act of provocation. There was a quiet seriousness in George's demeanor, an understanding and awareness that suggested he was ready to act if necessary. The guard, too, felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The tension in his body eased further, and he regained a sense of composure, now supported not just by training, but by the attentive presence of the young prince. George continued to observe, noticing every small detail. The way the man's hands moved, the slight twitch in his expression, and the subtle changes in tone all provided clues about his intentions. George's mind processed each detail carefully, thinking about the best way to ensure respect and safety without escalating the situation. He understood that true courage was about action, but also about timing, understanding, and careful judgment. As the moments passed, the man appeared to reconsider his behavior. He shifted slightly, lowering his voice, and his gestures became less provocative. George could sense that his quiet attentiveness had influenced the situation. By observing carefully, showing respect, and standing with quiet confidence, he had already begun to change the energy around him. The guard, now feeling supported and less pressured, began to regain full composure. His eyes softened, his posture steadied, and a small sense of relief crossed his face. George felt a quiet satisfaction, understanding that even small acts of presence and attention could have meaningful effects. The crowd continued to enjoy the garden, still largely unaware of the small tension that had arisen. Children laughed, birds sang, and the sunlight continued to shine warmly. Yet, amidst the normal activity of the day, a small drama had quietly unfolded, unnoticed by most. George had observed, understood, and prepared himself for action. He had already influenced the situation through his calm, steady presence, demonstrating a courage and understanding beyond his years. George realized an important lesson in those moments. Courage could appear in quiet ways, and even young individuals could make a meaningful difference when they acted with empathy, awareness, and composure. By noticing the guard's subtle distress and maintaining his calm attentiveness, he had already played a role in diffusing a potentially uncomfortable situation. As he stood there, small but confident, Prince George understood that he was learning something valuable about respect, fairness, and bravery. He felt a quiet pride not for himself, but for the way he could help others through careful observation and thoughtful action. And as the sun continued to shine and the crowd continued to enjoy the day, George knew that this small moment of awareness and readiness could lead to something even greater, a moment where courage and kindness might be needed more actively. The morning sun continued to shine brightly over the palace gardens, casting a warm glow over the neatly trimmed lawns and colorful flower beds. Prince George had been observing the situation quietly, his sharp eyes noting every movement, expression, and subtle shift in the atmosphere. He understood, even at his young age, that some moments demanded action. Not loud, dramatic action, but calm and confident intervention that could make a difference. The man provoking the royal guard had begun to slow his gestures, sensing that his actions were being noticed in a way he had not expected. George knew that the moment had arrived to step in, to help restore calm and fairness, and to act with kindness and courage. Taking a careful step forward, George positioned himself closer to the guard, but still maintaining a respectful distance. His small figure moved with quiet confidence, his head held high and his eyes steady. The man, noticing the young prince approaching, paused and looked at him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. George did not flinch. He stood calmly, his demeanor serious yet gentle, radiating a quiet strength that made it clear he was attentive and ready to act if needed. Even though he was small in stature, there was an unmistakable sense of authority in the way he carried himself, a sense that commanded attention without demanding it. George's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, clear, and polite. He addressed the man directly but without anger or harshness. "Excuse me," he said, "it is not right to bother someone who is only doing their job. Please be kind." The words were simple, but they carried weight far beyond what the man had expected from a young child. The crowd, which had been largely unaware of the tension until now, began to notice the interaction. Some people turned their heads, curious about the small prince speaking with such confidence and composure. George's voice did not shake, and his tone conveyed a sense of fairness, respect, and understanding that even adults found remarkable. The man looked momentarily stunned. He had not expected to be addressed by Prince George, and certainly not in a way that felt firm yet polite. The guard, who had been holding his composure with great effort, allowed a small, grateful smile to appear on his face. George's words had eased the tension without causing embarrassment or conflict. It was a subtle act, but one that demonstrated courage, empathy, and wisdom beyond his years. The man, sensing the seriousness of the situation, paused and appeared to reconsider his actions. George took a small, measured step closer to the guard, standing as a quiet shield, not as a threat. His presence communicated support and protection, showing that he was ready to act if the man persisted, but hoping that such action would not be necessary. The crowd, now noticing the change in atmosphere, began to whisper quietly among themselves. Some admired the young prince's confidence, others were amazed at his ability to handle the situation calmly, and a few simply smiled at the display of maturity and courage. George's attention remained focused, however, entirely on ensuring that the guard felt supported and that the situation would not escalate. The man, realizing that his actions had been noticed and gently corrected by a young member of the royal family, began to step back. His gestures became less pronounced, and his tone softened. He appeared slightly embarrassed but not angry, as if he understood that he had been reminded of a simple truth. Respect and kindness matter, and even small individuals can have a powerful impact. George's calm demeanor and polite words had diffused the tension without causing humiliation, showing that true courage often comes from quiet confidence and thoughtful action. George noticed that the guard's posture relaxed even further. The small smile of gratitude grew slightly, though the guard remained professional and composed. George understood that sometimes support did not require dramatic gestures or words. Simply being present, attentive, and ready to help could make a profound difference. The guard now felt less alone, more confident in maintaining composure, and reassured by the young prince's thoughtful intervention. Encouraged by the positive change, George spoke again, this time addressing the man with gentle firmness. "It is always better to treat people with respect. Everyone deserves kindness, no matter their role." The words were simple, clear, and delivered without any hint of anger. The man nodded slowly, realizing that his actions had been inappropriate. He stepped further back, now aware that the young prince was observing him closely and that any further provocation would not be tolerated. George's calm authority had created a boundary, one that was understood without conflict or force. The crowd continued to watch, increasingly impressed by the young prince's composure. Children whispered to their parents, saying things like, "Look, he's so brave." Adults exchanged smiles, recognizing that even someone so young could teach lessons about respect, courage, and fairness. George did not let the attention distract him. His focus remained entirely on the guard and the man, ensuring that the situation remained calm and safe. He understood that true leadership was about awareness, empathy, and timely action, not seeking applause or recognition. The guard, now fully composed, gave a subtle nod of gratitude to Prince George. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible gesture, but it conveyed deep appreciation. George felt a small sense of satisfaction, understanding that his presence and gentle words had provided the guard with support and protection. He also realized that courage was not always about grand gestures or heroic feats. Sometimes it was about noticing the right moment to act, choosing words carefully, and standing with calm confidence. The man provoking the guard now appeared to fully understand the impact of his behavior. He stepped back, lowered his hands, and spoke softly, perhaps apologetically. George's calm intervention had transformed the situation from one of potential conflict to one of learning and understanding. By remaining composed and acting with kindness, he had helped both the guard and the man see a better way forward. The energy of the garden shifted back to calm and harmony, with the sunlight reflecting off the flowers and the laughter of children resuming its natural rhythm. George's mother, observing her son, felt a surge of pride. She knew that George was learning lessons in leadership, respect, and empathy that went far beyond his years. By acting calmly and thoughtfully, he had shown that courage and maturity were not determined by age or size, but by understanding, awareness, and the willingness to do what is right. She smiled gently, allowing him to continue engaging with the situation while keeping him safe and supported. George, aware of the subtle shift in the atmosphere, took a step back, maintaining his calm and polite demeanor. He had intervened successfully, providing support for the guard and helping the man understand the importance of respect and kindness. The tension that had been building slowly dissipated, replaced by a quiet understanding and restored harmony. George felt a small sense of accomplishment, not for personal recognition, but for the knowledge that he had acted in a way that mattered. The crowd, now fully attentive, began to whisper in admiration. Some visitors commented on the young prince's bravery, others marveled at his ability to handle the situation calmly, and a few noted how unusual it was to see someone so young act with such poise and understanding. George, however, remained focused on the people directly involved. He understood that true courage was not about applause or admiration, but about helping others, creating safety, and promoting kindness. As the sunlight continued to illuminate the gardens, George noticed the subtle smiles on the faces of other nearby guards. They had witnessed the young prince's intervention and understood its significance. Even those trained in discipline and composure could appreciate the courage it took to act thoughtfully, politely, and effectively at such a young age. George realized that sometimes leadership was quiet, gentle, and unobtrusive, yet immensely powerful. His actions had shown that courage, respect, and kindness could influence not only individuals but the entire atmosphere around them. The man who had provoked the guard now stepped fully back, his gestures restrained and his tone polite. He appeared to understand, quietly, that he had been reminded of the importance of treating others with respect. George's calm and confident intervention had provided a model of behavior, showing that even small, thoughtful words could redirect a situation positively. The guard, now fully composed, maintained his post with renewed confidence, knowing he was supported and respected. George's mind reflected on the lessons of the moment. He understood that courage could be gentle and leadership could be quiet. Respect was powerful, and kindness could influence even those who acted thoughtlessly. By acting with awareness, empathy, and calm confidence, he had helped restore harmony and create a positive outcome. The young prince felt a sense of quiet pride, knowing that he had contributed to the safety and dignity of others without seeking attention or praise. As the crowd returned to enjoying the garden, laughter and conversation filling the air once more, George walked alongside his mother, still observing the world with keen eyes. He understood that every moment, no matter how small, could teach important lessons about bravery, empathy, and the power of thoughtful action. The sun continued to shine, the flowers continued to bloom, and Prince George's small but courageous intervention had left a lasting impression on all who had noticed. George had acted with clarity, kindness, and courage. He had shown that even a young child could make a meaningful difference in the world by paying attention, acting thoughtfully, and standing up for what was right. In that quiet yet significant moment, he had demonstrated the essence of leadership: empathy, respect, and the quiet courage to do what must be done. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting warm light across the palace gardens. The air was filled with the soft murmur of visitors, the laughter of children, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Prince George walked slowly with his mother, still processing the events that had unfolded moments ago. The tension in the garden had disappeared, replaced by calm and quiet admiration from the few who had noticed the interaction. George felt a small sense of satisfaction, but more importantly, he felt a growing understanding of what it meant to act with courage, respect, and kindness. Even though he was young, George realized that moments like these were important. They were small yet meaningful, and they had the power to teach lessons not just to those directly involved, but to everyone who observed. The guard he had supported now stood confidently, fully composed, with a subtle but sincere nod in George's direction. That small gesture was enough to make George understand that his actions had been effective. He had helped someone maintain dignity and calm, and that, he thought, was a true measure of courage. As they walked along the winding garden paths, George's mother spoke softly to him. "You handled that very well," she said, her voice warm and filled with pride. "You were calm, kind, and brave. I am very proud of you." George looked up at her, a small smile on his face. He had acted instinctively, guided by what he felt was right, and now he understood that his actions had made a difference. He realized that courage was not about loud words or grand gestures, but about quiet, thoughtful decisions that helped others and preserved harmony. The visitors in the garden had begun to take notice as well. Some were whispering to one another, pointing subtly toward the young prince and his calm demeanor. Children looked on with wide eyes, inspired by the bravery and composure of someone close to their own age. Adults exchanged glances, silently recognizing the rare maturity and empathy displayed by someone so young. George, aware of the attention but not distracted by it, continued to walk with purpose, understanding that true leadership and courage often went unnoticed, yet left lasting impressions. The man who had provoked the guard earlier now appeared calmer. He seemed to understand, at least in part, the lessons that George's calm intervention had imparted. While he had been testing the guard, George's presence and polite, firm words had reminded him of the importance of respect and consideration for others. George understood that change sometimes started with small moments like this. One act of courage, one gentle correction, could create a ripple effect, encouraging kindness and fairness in ways that were subtle yet powerful. George thought about the guard as they continued their walk. The man had remained professional, strong, and composed throughout the provocation, but George's small intervention had helped him feel supported. It was a reminder that even those who appear strong at all times can benefit from encouragement, empathy, and assistance. George's young mind recognized that leadership and support were not limited to age or rank. They were qualities that could be expressed by anyone, anywhere, and at any time. The garden seemed brighter now, filled with a renewed sense of peace and harmony. Children ran along the paths, waving small flags and laughing, while adults continued to admire the flowers and fountains. George felt a quiet joy in the simple pleasures of the day, understanding that the world was full of small opportunities to act with kindness and courage. He reflected on how observing closely, noticing the needs of others, and acting thoughtfully had changed the mood of the moment. It was a lesson he would carry with him for years to come. As George walked alongside his mother, he noticed other members of the royal family greeting visitors from a distance. The atmosphere was one of warmth, respect, and admiration. George understood that the family's example of kindness and leadership influenced everyone around them, and that small acts of bravery and empathy were noticed even more when they were done quietly and respectfully. He realized that being a member of the royal family was not just about appearances or ceremonies, but also about the opportunity to guide, support, and inspire others through actions, both big and small. George's mother knelt slightly to speak with him. "You showed true courage today," she said. "Sometimes it is not about fighting or making a scene, but about noticing when someone needs help and offering it in a kind way." "You understood that very well." George nodded, absorbing the words with the quiet maturity that had impressed everyone earlier. He felt proud but not boastful. The pride he felt came from knowing he had helped, not from seeking recognition. It was a lesson in humility, one that he would carry with him in every situation he faced. The guard, now fully composed and confident, approached George briefly. He gave a small, respectful nod of thanks, a gesture that spoke volumes. George returned the nod with a gentle smile. Though they were from very different worlds, one a young prince, the other a professional guard, the moment had connected them through mutual respect and understanding. George realized that even small gestures of support could create bonds of trust and appreciation that lasted far beyond the immediate situation. As the day progressed, George noticed more subtle details in the garden. Visitors smiled politely, children played nearby, and the overall atmosphere was peaceful and pleasant. He thought about how small actions, like his quiet intervention, could influence not just individuals, but the environment as a whole. Kindness, respect, and courage had a way of spreading quietly, touching many people without them even realizing the source. George understood that he had witnessed this in action, and that his own behavior had contributed to the calm and harmony of the moment. George also reflected on the man who had caused the tension earlier. While he had been provocative and disrespectful at first, he had now changed his demeanor. George understood that people could learn, change, and respond positively when approached with calmness, firmness, and kindness. It was a valuable lesson that courage and leadership were not just about controlling situations, but about guiding them toward understanding, empathy, and respect. George felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that he had played a part in creating that understanding. Walking through the gardens, George began to notice the reactions of those around him. A few visitors exchanged quiet remarks about the young prince's composure, marveling at his bravery and thoughtful action. Children pointed out to their parents how confident he had been, while adults admired the calm, respectful way he had handled a challenging situation. George, however, remained focused on the people directly involved, understanding that the true value of his actions lay not in the attention received, but in the positive change he had inspired. George thought about what he had learned from the experience. He understood that courage was not about showing off, nor was leadership about making decisions that only served oneself. True courage and leadership were about empathy, observation, and thoughtful action. They were about noticing when someone needed help, offering support, and gently guiding others toward fairness and respect. George felt grateful for the opportunity to act in such a way, understanding that even small actions could have lasting impact. The sun continued to shine warmly over the palace gardens, illuminating the flowers, fountains, and neatly trimmed paths. The day felt peaceful, yet George knew that the lessons he had learned today were important. He had seen firsthand how empathy, courage, and thoughtful intervention could influence others and change the atmosphere of a place. He understood that leadership and bravery were qualities that could be expressed by anyone, regardless of age or stature, and that even small actions could create meaningful change. As he walked alongside his mother, George noticed the subtle smiles of guards and visitors alike. He realized that the moment he had acted would be remembered quietly, as an example of courage, empathy, and respect. The guard he had helped would carry the memory of support. The man who had provoked would remember the lesson in kindness, and the visitors who observed would carry inspiration from seeing a young prince act thoughtfully and bravely. George felt a sense of connection to all these people, understanding that his actions had created a ripple of positive influence that extended beyond the immediate moment. George's mother squeezed his hand gently. "You have shown wisdom beyond your years," she said softly. "Remember that true courage and leadership are shown in actions, no matter how small, and in the care we show for others. Today, you have done that beautifully." George smiled quietly, feeling the weight of her words and understanding their meaning. He knew that the lessons he had learned today would stay with him for a lifetime, shaping the way he acted, observed, and interacted with others. As the day drew on and the palace gardens began to grow busier with visitors, George felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The incident with the guard had ended peacefully, and the atmosphere was harmonious once more. He understood that courage was not always about dramatic acts, but about small, thoughtful interventions that respected others, promoted fairness, and preserved harmony. George felt proud not for recognition, but for the knowledge that he had acted rightly, and that his actions had made a difference. Looking around the garden, George noticed children playing, adults chatting, and guards standing attentively, all contributing to the peaceful and joyful atmosphere. He realized that life was full of opportunities to act with kindness, courage, and empathy, and that every moment, no matter how small, could matter. Today had been one of those moments, and George had acted with calm confidence, thoughtful words, and quiet bravery. As the sun began to descend slightly, casting a golden glow over the garden, George walked slowly, reflecting on the lessons of the day. He understood that courage, leadership, and kindness were not just words. They were actions, thoughts, and intentions that could create a lasting impact. By stepping in quietly, supporting the guard, and addressing the situation calmly and respectfully, he had demonstrated the qualities that made a true leader: empathy, fairness, and courage. The day ended on a peaceful note, with the palace gardens returning to their normal rhythm of laughter, conversation, and natural beauty. George had learned that even a young prince could make a difference, not through force or authority, but through observation, thoughtful action, and empathy. The experience would remain with him, shaping his understanding of responsibility, kindness, and leadership for years to come. In that quiet yet meaningful moment, Prince George understood something important: that true courage and leadership are measured not by grand gestures, but by the care we show for others, the fairness we uphold, and the thoughtful actions we take, even in small moments. And as the palace gardens basked in the gentle sunlight, George felt a sense of quiet pride, knowing that he had acted rightly, inspired respect, and left a positive mark on everyone who had witnessed the day's events.